Good evening. The time is 6:30. I'd like to call the Planning and Zoning Workshop meeting to order. The date is Tuesday, April 26th. Can I have a roll call, please?
Timmons. Present. Mata.
Present.
Snydow.
Present.
Guerra.
Here.
McCall.
Here.
Thank you. 5 members present. We have a quorum. Next, citizen comments. At this time, any members of the public who would like to speak are able. We ask that you fill out a citizen comments form, that you state your name, and that you limit your time to 3 minutes. If there's anyone who would like to speak, I'm opening citizen comments now. Seeing none, I will go ahead and close citizen comments. Citizen comments is now closed. Item number 4, general discussion. 4B, discussion regarding code amendments to the M1, M2, and M3 zoning districts. Mr. Atkinson.
Good evening, commissioners. Before you, we have a request by Patty Snydow to consider some adjustments to our code relating to manufactured homes and relating to, I believe, primarily focusing on how we define the foundation and what have you. So she's been asking for us to consider this for a while, so we felt it was appropriate to bring it forward. Now, I'll say this. I'm going to primarily defer to Patty, as she's the one who's most familiar with this, this request. So I'm going to let you take the floor.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert at it by any means. I've just pulled the information. But I think the overall goal for me is to improve the quality and building standard if it needs to be done for manufactured housing. I think manufactured housing is a very viable option for affordable housing, but if they are set on a permanent foundation, they can be financed by FHA and VA, and they are actually the same quality as a stick-built home. So then you've got a really nice product for a family that they can stay in long-term. They're more secure. They're financeable, they can refinance them, they can get repair loans on them. When you have a product that is not necessarily on that permanent foundation, they're difficult. You can't finance them, you can't sell them with a realtor, you can't, it's hard to get a loan on them other than private financing, so you don't always get the best rates and terms. So what I'm looking at is, this is a viable affordable housing option for Kyle. I think it could be a valuable option, but I'd like to see them conform to where the homeowners can access FHA, VA financing and have a stable, nice place, and nice neighborhoods. So that's kind of my overall goal. And the idea is that HUD is the, housing, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is kind of the end-all and be-all for affordable housing. I work for Rural Development, which is a division of USDA, and we follow HUD guidelines for ours because they're the experts. They have an entire division that does nothing but manufactured housing. So that's what they do. And so they've just completed new regulations, which I have not read through, but it was changing anything in the government takes years, so it was years in process, but it was done with all parties at the table, meaning manufactured housing developers at the table, manufacturers at the table, all the key people were at the table so that they could come up with regulations that really worked for everybody. So the intention is not to make them extremely expensive or, anything extreme, but to make them decent, safe, and sanitary. That's our mission, is decent, safe, and sanitary. And so that's why I've brought this forward. And I also asked the staff, which they did a great job of pulling the permit guide for San Marcos. And what I really like is this timeline for manufactured homes that Austin has. And a couple things that we were pointing out, because we've talked about it, is the definition for manufactured housing, and also in the definition on this Austin one, which is this thingy here, this one. This one talks about that the product itself, the unit itself, comes with a HUD certification, which means that the construction of that actual part, whether it's 2 parts or 3 parts that it comes in, meet the criteria, a building criteria. And that's HVAC, that's energy efficiency, that is building standards as far as structurally sound. So it meets a certain criteria of substantial construction. And so that's what Austin's using, that's what I would ask also. And then another piece is this third box here on the right on that same page. It talks about a permanent foundation. And a permanent foundation is key for FHA and VA. And so that is something that I would like us to consider as well. And I'd like this, I think the city does a great job, and then this will roll down to permitting and inspecting and all of that. But I think it could really elevate quality housing and affordable housing in Kyle, in my opinion. So I would appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you. Will, I have a couple of questions just to start off the conversation. First, could you help clarify, you've said it before, but can you clarify for us again what the difference is between M1, M2, and M3?
Sure, I was actually just pulling that up. I'll start with the M1. The M1 zoning district is actually, that one's the easiest one to define. It is a zoning district that you can only get in one condition. It's if you are a manufactured home subdivision that was approved and is being built, or you're under construction, or partway through the process in the county, and then at some point the city had come in and started annexing the process, so you're vested at a standard from the county, and that delineates from the city's perspective that it's a project that's grandfathered and coming into the city, so it doesn't meet our code necessarily the way we have it in our code and what have you. Otherwise, you can't receive the M1 zoning designation. You can't rezone to it otherwise at another time after you're already in the city. If you were, say you have some ag zoning inside the city, you can't zone it already to M1 unless you were partway through the process when you were in the county, got your permits from the county and what have you. The M2 zoning, it is a public subdivision. It's fee simple lots, just like your standard residential subdivision, but you can have manufactured homes on it. So you have public roads, public water, wastewater, lots are fee simple, and what have you. And the M3 is the exact same way, except everything's private. And you're leasing a pad site for the manufactured home. So the streets inside the subdivision are private, wastewater, water's private. They all tie in at one point into the public system. And you can't have public roads except for like your primary entrance points per fire code tying into it. You can't have you can't have multiple points otherwise tying into it. It has to be its own little enclave. But the biggest difference is fee simple versus non-fee simple lots.
Great.
So,
Thank you.
from our perspective.
So following up on that, so the M1, manufactured home subdivision already in progress, being annexed into the city. In that situation, how restrictive can we be? If the process has already begun, could we then say you must meet X, Y, and Z, or rule? We could change it, but if it's part of the annexation being moved in, I'm not sure if any of these changes we might make now might be applicable at their point in the process.
No, regarding the M1, we put the M1 on this tonight's agenda just for discussion, so we could
Absolutely.
But state law allows a project to continue at its grandfathering status, even if it's annexed. Okay. And the city would be very likely, we would get in trouble and maybe even sued if we tried to adjust for it after the fact for someone who was already vested coming in. Okay.
No, thank you for clarifying that. I do have another question. So currently, right now, someone would have a manufactured subdivision in M2, M3, and they could choose, they could choose to either have the fixed foundation or they could put them on cinder blocks or something not fixed, correct? And either one of those would be an option, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
We don't, as long as, I'll say this: I am not the building official, so I know they look at it from a regulatory standpoint, from the building code and how it relates to manufactured homes. And I don't know I don't know all the details behind that. So I know they look at it from that perspective, but they look at it from a sufficient foundation per the building code, whether it's tied down to cinder blocks or something similar,
Right.
or it's on a permanent foundation. So now, from a practical perspective, being the M3 is a for lease site, there's not likely going to be permanently or houses permanently tied to a foundation in there. Maybe if they have like a little amenity center, if they have a manufactured home in there for that for some reason, but that'd be probably it. Whereas fee simple, you could go either way.
Okay.
On the M2.
And since they can choose between either permanent or not, the ones that we have now, it seems that they're mostly choosing not. Do we have subdivisions now that are choosing to put permanent foundations when we're not requiring them to?
Yeah.
Okay.
The M2. I'm trying to think if right now the two biggest manufactured home projects that we're reviewing the biggest one primarily is the second phase for Sunset Ridge over on East FM 150, and because it's the M2, I believe, or did I get that backwards? Hold on. No, it's M3. It's M3. Because they're for lease. None of them are permanently tied down because it just doesn't make sense from that perspective. Because people are going to go in, maybe they'll rent for 2 or 3 years, and then they'll move the house out or what have you and go somewhere else. The Tenorio subdivision, which is on the south side of West Center Street, between Stagecoach Crossing and Center Street, it's kind of tucked in between. They're zoned M2. And so they could, if they so choose, with the way our code currently reads, to either tie it down with to cinder blocks or something similar appropriate, or they could do a permanent foundation. And not ironically, but some of the houses there, as you know, that's a generational neighborhood in there frequently, and so a lot of them, not all of them, but you'll see over time they'll have a 1970s era single wide in there. They'll move it out. They'll move into a modern manufactured home, a HUD certified one probably, I presume, or one that meets the building code at least. But there's also scattered throughout there as their prospects improve. Like they'll move the house out and they'll build a house on site, which we absolutely allow. One constructed on site, stick built house. So there's a scattering of that in there. And it's pretty flexible, actually, from that perspective. They still got to meet as best as possible. The impervious cover, we work with them on that. The building setbacks, parking ratios, all that kind of stuff. But yeah.
I guess my question really comes down to, are most of these subdivisions that come in meeting the minimum requirement, and that's it? If being on a fixed permanent foundation is optional, but it's above what the minimum requirement is, I guess I'm curious as to if anyone actually is going above and beyond to that level, or they pretty much would only go up to that level if it was required.
They have the option.
Right, but have they been taking that option is what I'm asking.
The ones over there in the Tenorio subdivision it's not very often. Most of them are existing. Every now and then we'll get one. So I don't remember offhand. I would, if I were to hazard a guess, I would say no, because it's more expensive,
Right.
At least up front. So.
Great. Sorry, I've kind of taken up the floor.
That's fine.
If anybody else has questions, please jump in.
I have a couple questions. So if someone was to build a stick-built house in an M2 subdivision, they would have to go in for like proper foundation permits with soil reports
Yes.
and everything to
Yeah.
make sure that it's like for safety reasons. So I'm not really sure why we don't do that in terms of like safety, life safety with manufactured homes.
I don't think it's ever been considered before.
Okay.
Now, they do meet the building code.
The homes themselves do.
Yes, the
Right.
manufactured homes and the tie downs that they have to meet the code. They are code compliant. The building official looks at them. Now, requiring the foundation, the permanent foundation goes above and beyond that. And there's advantages to it, as Patty has stated, in terms of better financing, building equity, and what have you, and all that. But this is Patty's request to bring this up is the first time it's been considered, honestly, because I suspect generally how the city views manufactured homes, they're more temporary in nature because they tend to be not up to as high of a standard from a house that's built on site, or at least there's that notion. If I'm making, mind you, I don't know all the details behind them. If y'all think it's appropriate to require a permanent foundation, then we should consider that. If it makes it better in the long run for the residents, I personally don't have a problem with that, and that's something we can talk about. So,
And then in terms of if the manufactured home is being inspected by the building inspector, right now they don't inspect the foundations?
They do where they're to meet building code, where they're tie into the water, the wastewater, how they're tied down to their foundations, whether they're the cinder. I say cinder blocks for lack of a better term, mind you. There could be something a little bit more robust that they're using. Like the building official has to review it to make sure it's compliant per the building code, and then the inspector goes out and makes sure it matches. And from that perspective, but there is not a requirement that they have to be on be permanently affixed to a foundation either.
But so for structural integrity, like when there's, gusts of winds, they don't have to necessarily be like how these permanent foundations are engineered so that when there's like uplift or whatever, they're there to resist that. The ones that aren't on permanent foundations.
I don't know the answer to that question. I presume so. We have to fall back to the building code because I don't know that answer.
Okay. I think it sounds like a good idea. And then in terms of, they would still be able to move them even if they're on a permanent engineered foundation that's up to HUD standards. Because it shows in the San Marcos one that even if you are in a temporary, I think it was San Marcos, a temporary community, which I'm assuming that's the ones you would move in and out, they still have permanent foundations. Where did I see that?
So I guess my question is, if it's a permanent foundation and the house is affixed to it, does that not make the house permanently affixed to the foundation? Like, you can't remove it from it?
Right, I thought that's why you could get a loan and such on it. Yeah. But because of it's no longer mobile. But I could be wrong on that.
I don't know, we could talk to San Marcos and get more information from them, but it's just a more stable design. They may not be able to get a loan if it's not, if it's not fixed. I mean, if it's not a part of the land and permanently. I'm not sure they could get a loan without the foundation. Go ahead.
Maybe it's when it's a permanent foundation, they get the loan. Maybe it's something that, all right, this is where you're going to stay. You can't move, like it's your permanent house. Like,
Right.
I'm sure that's, and if they decide, well,
Yeah.
10 years later, hey, we actually want to move, I don't know, would that carry over? I mean, because,
Probably not.
yeah, it's, if you have your a regular house, you can, you just, I want to take my house, but I want to move it, across the street. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so that's probably something in the actual contract that they signed that, all right, this is where you're going to be. Now, if you want to move, you have to sell your house and then reapply. So.
And I think that's where FHA and VA are, that it's not moving. The ones that I have seen available on Zillow, and they do have them for sale on Zillow, are the ones that would be like in Sunset Ridge, and they are for sale by owner, financed by owner. And so they're buying their unit and then leasing their spot. I don't know what their financing rates are, though, but
I wouldn't know either.
yeah.
So my question is, one, is it appropriate to have this requirement? I think from a safety perspective, mind you, this is just coming from how I feel about it. It doesn't come from anything from a logical perspective. I don't know the ins and outs of the building code and what have you. It's probably appropriate to some extent from the fee simple lots in the M2 zoning district. It could be piers, it could be pier and beam, it could be solid slab or something in between, whatever, from the building code, if it's a permanent, whatever the requirements are for permanent foundations. In the M3, it's probably not appropriate. I think from a use perspective, there's a clear delineation there, and the way those subdivisions are operated. So that's my personal opinion. Something else that we can consider if we wanted to discuss about this at another time. In addition, if we feel it warrants more, we can ask the building official to come and talk too, which is something, as we're discussing, I feel like I should have reached out. So it's probably a good idea.
Yeah, I think it would just to get some clarification about what a permanent foundation is, because it seems like you could have a foundation there and still move the houses, but then the foundation would be like engineered. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of
but
thinking.
Then you only have a foundation left, and then you
Yeah,
have to
but
find
if
a house
you're
that fits on there.
leasing a lot or whatever,
Yeah.
then it would be like, this is where, because when you have a foundation in a house, they have to do like soil samples and see how far, whatever, all the engineering that goes along with it. You can't just like put a house anywhere. So it seems like, I mean, this is a house. This is where people are living. There's, all the live loads and all that stuff, the roof load, everything still goes into it. It just isn't, manufactured somewhere else and brought onto site.
Okay, so here's my general thoughts about it. Typically, I prefer to let the market kind of dictate these things, but there are times when you have a minimum bar, that's all you get. When with just regular R1, R2 subdivisions, you have the option of putting the garage in the front or the back, but when you have that option, everyone put it in the front. And so when you have a certain baseline, people tend to go to that. And so it's good to review this. It's good to look over this and think through our options. But I do agree, at least with the information we have now, if we did want to move forward with this, I would be in support of a permanent foundation for M2 as a recommendation to council, but not for M1 or M3.
It could still be optional for M3, correct? It should be.
Yeah. We wouldn't need to make a change to M3. It could be up to them in that case. Just given I'll say the more flexible nature of that type of the private subdivision, and it's being leased out and what have you. So.
Okay. And then what I would also like to do is separate those two zonings. So if a new subdivision, a new manufactured housing subdivision comes in, I wouldn't want it to come in as M2 and M2, M3. I would want to know which it is.
Oh, it would. We would.
It would be M2 or
M3.
M3, not an M2, M3, and we'll let you know.
Correct. They have to choose.
Okay.
We would, and that's something that's discussed when at the very beginning, when a developer wants to come talk to staff, they'll say, hey, we want to do a manufactured home subdivision.
Right.
And then we'll have that conversation with them. Okay, is everything going to be private inside? Are you going to lease this all out? Or are you is this going to be fee simple? And you go from there. And then we'll and if the comp plan supports it and everything, we'll bring it forward to to y'all as the Planning and Zoning Commission for a recommendation vote. And then it would, just like any other zoning, it would.
And does both M2 and M3 require that the longest portion of the house face the street?
Yeah, the long face of the house has to be parallel to the street. So now the Sunset Ridge subdivision.
I was gonna say.
I knew you were gonna go there. They have a settlement agreement with the city. The first phase of Section 2 was platted in like 2004 or something
Okay.
like that. And so those lots and how they're lotting the houses on there, they're sliding them in like shotgun
Yeah.
houses. They reflect that because there's no way, you can't cross the property boundaries of
Right.
the house.
Yeah,
And so they were allowed to continue that. It was already a platted recorded lot, or section, excuse me. Now, the ones following that, phase 2B, C, and D they're code compliant.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
So they gotta be parallel,
yeah.
so.
If we did change M2 and not M3, I'm afraid of the unintended consequence of then what we're really saying is we're encouraging people to try to go M3 instead of M2, which is not what I want to encourage to happen.
So we don't have a lot of requests for manufactured homes to be built in Kyle from a development standpoint. We've gotten the Sunset Ridge, which there's a settlement agreement with the city and the developer. And then there's the one that we had I don't remember if y'all remember about a year or so back, the comp plan amendment off of BB Road. And then the zoning that followed to rezone to, I think it was M3. Just right next to that existing lakeside crossing. So that one, those are the only two requests that we've really had. And that one's going to be compliant. They're about to submit site plans for that. And I've seen at least at a glance what it looks like, and lots are big enough. They meet the minimum standards, and it's going to be big enough for parallel to the road. So.
Is that Lakeside Crossing, are those on permanent foundations?
No, they're not. It's a case where it would be an M1 zoning district.
Okay.
Because it was started back when it was in the county, and then we annexed it.
And then I have another question. So M3 is the private, that's why there's
Yes.
the different, okay.
Yes.
So if there was do we ever get housing subdivisions that are all private, like private roads, private,
We can.
but they
It's-
still have to go through all the inspections?
Yeah, definitely. We can do it. It's not typical. In those cases, if it's your standard residential subdivision, but everything's private inside, it'd be more of a condominium regime kind of idea. When they'd really just be really wide access easements that look like streets.
Yeah,
So.
okay. I think we should raise the bar. I think that's a good. Yeah.
Are you saying for both M2 and M3?
I
or are you
would,
saying
but
okay.
yeah. But I think it would be really great to get the building
Yeah.
inspector and then just understand the engineering of it. Like, what can you do if it is a leased property? Would they just have to site the foundations and then you could move in and tie down to those permanent foundations and then move away? Or would you have to just go sell everything?
I don't know for that as far as removing it once it's on, but I know as far as if we were in a rural area, which we're not anymore, we have a home repair program that we can't assist people with if they're in a manufactured homes that's not on a permanent foundation, but a part of our funding can be used to put it on a permanent foundation. So the house can be moved off, permanent foundation put on, and the house popped back on, and then suddenly it's a single-family home, not a manufactured home anymore.
Okay, so direction for staff, I guess, is the question now. So we are talking about we would like your guys' general input on this because, you know, what should happen now is that we would kind of give what our general consensus is to staff, and then hopefully staff can take that and make an item for a future regular meeting. Is that correct?
Let's do another workshop, which
Okay.
we could do that for the fourth Tuesday in May,
Okay.
and that with the intent of inviting the building official as well.
Okay.
His name's Gary Stubbins, a very knowledgeable man, very professional, knows what he's doing. So.
Is everybody okay with that? I mean, having another workshop about the same item?
Yeah, my only hesitation about requiring the foundations in M2 would be are we locking somebody in to saying, okay, you put it down, you can't ever move it? You know, you've got that flexibility in M3 that you can pick up your home and move it. But it seems like the only option, if you are saying that a pier and beam foundation is considered permanent, that if you put it on a pier and beam, it would be a whole lot easier to move it if you choose to do that than it would be on a slab foundation.
Maybe. I don't
Possibly.
know.
I mean, that's,
I think that's a good question for the building.
yeah, and that's what I'd like to,
Because I agree with Commissioner Cal, is that I'd like to see it raised for two of them, and then the building inspector can tell me why we can't.
Yeah. If there's practical reasons why this is not a good idea, we should hear those as well.
That's what I'd like to see personally.
Okay.
but that's
Okay.
just me.
Good. So if we're all good to keep this conversation going, bring it back next month, that's what we'll do. If anyone else has anything else, we can definitely talk about it now, but otherwise we can move on if everyone's ready. All right. Item number 4C, discussion regarding public restrooms near Mary Hartson Square Park. Mr. Atkinson.
All right, this one does not have any backup material because primarily it was something that council wanted to see to give staff and the Planning and Zoning Commission direction to consider. And it sort of ties into 4D as well in an ancillary fashion. But as we've invested a lot of money in the downtown square, in the park there, there's also a realization that there's not any regularly operated hours for public restrooms. The only ones that technically would be in the Kyle area senior zone in the Krug Center, which it's not really available for the public in general, or City Hall right here, which is relatively close. It's actually not very far away, but it's very inconvenient, especially if you have a child and they're playing on the playground and you got to run all of a sudden. Friday, I was over here at the Earth Day event in the evening, and we had my family here, and twice I had to bring a kid over here to City Hall. And luckily, I had my badge, right? So I could get in, and City Hall wasn't open. So right there. And I just happen to be lucky because I work here, so I can get in City Hall. So there wasn't a lot of detail provided in the item to consider to staff or the Planning and Zoning Commission, but they do want us to discuss it and bring something forward. I presume, I don't know if they want us to make a metric out of it, like generally, like how many public restrooms do we need? Like how many stalls, what's to some extent it's probably gonna have to deal with the building code, what's the expected capacity in a park at any given time, and what should be there, what's appropriate. Actually, Megan, you might have some insight into that, maybe.
I don't know the code offhand, but
Okay.
yeah, generally there is like how many toilets you need to provide in terms of building. But also I was thinking that it would be interesting, like if you go along the hike and bike trail in Austin, how they've made the public restrooms sort of sculptural or part of like the arts in the landscape. So when we look at the downtown plan, if there could be some sort of, like art centered or sort of place making out of the restroom. or how it would connect to whatever else is going to be built around there. Those are just very vague, general ideas, but. So yes, looking at the code and then also possibilities of how to make it like a nice place. So it's not just like a restroom that people, at a park kind of trash or something.
Yeah, we don't, that's what we want to avoid. We
Right,
want it
right.
without question.
Yeah,
It would need to be something, as odd as it sounds, to be proud of, given it's a restroom, but something that would fit in very nicely with the built environment that was just completed there, that would set a standard or a tone, and one that, at the same time, staff would also have to maintain it. It'd have to be cleaned daily, I presume, from that perspective. So there's a cost from the city's perspective. There's always a cost, though, right? So, but I do think it's appropriate on site or within the vicinity of that somewhere on that block on
Right.
city property.
Well, so what about that property across from the park on Burleson?
104 South Burleson.
Right.
So-
I mean, because building something on the actual square right now, I'm not, we just redid it.
Yeah.
It seems like we need to be in the vicinity, but not necessarily in the actual park. And that 104 South Burleson seems to be a prime location if that property doesn't already have a different specific use.
That's not a bad idea. I don't know if BGK Architects was just awarded, I think they were at the last council meeting or the one before that, the design for 104 South Burleson. It's like a $600,000 contract. It's going to be we think it's going to be a 3-story building with like a pass-through, like kind of like a breezeway. So if there's an opportunity to incorporate a public restroom into that, facing outward, or something appropriate that's obvious that it's a public restroom.
Right,
We
because,
can
I
ask
mean,
them.
yeah, even if it's on the outside of the building, but you can get access to it, or, however they want to do it is fine with me, but that has, it's very close. You'd have to cross the street or, but it's right there, and you wouldn't have to change the park that we just did.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have to open up the senior center either, so.
And it's a natural extension. Whatever is built there should be incorporated as a natural extension to the park itself.
Absolutely.
So
what about along the Vibe trails? This is sort of a little bit tangent. Are there going to be restrooms along there? Or have they not considered that yet?
it is not in the code that you have to do it.
Yeah, but
though
just-
it's a good idea. So the first round of code amendments we did was just to get a requirement in the code to build the Vibe trail system. If you're adjacent to it, you got to build your portion of it as a developer. And we wanted to get that in. And it's going to require tweaks from the Vibe perspective to make it a little bit more robust, without question. As development that comes into nodes, for those Vibe nodes comes along, scattered throughout the city, it's definitely appropriate to consider and incorporate public restrooms or publicly accessible restrooms into that account, because if people are going to be using it that frequently, the Vibe trail system, and coming to a higher density area, outdoor dining, amphitheater, what have you, you're going to need that, and they shouldn't be porta potties. So the BB PUD that was passed a couple months ago, they're north of Lowe's. I believe and I have to go back and look at the PUD document. I believe it talks about consideration of having a public restroom built into their development. So if memory serves, we negotiated that. Don't hold me to it though. but it's something we are considering generally. At this time, it's more of a negotiation item when developments come on. But that I really, as an idea, I do like the 104 South Burleson personally.
I don't know of another idea.
Yeah.
Because you are correct. Without that, City Hall seems to be one of the closest places with an already constructed restroom that's accessible, that could be, but there just isn't a lot of options.
Yeah.
There's parking all around the square, like maybe on the north side, or I guess not north side, the south side, maybe converting some of those parking spots into a, using, not some parking spots, it's already there, just converting that into a restroom,
Maybe.
right?
If the right of way is owned by the city, then that in the south, the west, or the east side, that makes it, from a regulatory standpoint, jurisdictionally, something that could be considered. Though it's not typical to, you got to be careful about putting a building in the public right of way, right? It's not generally a good idea just because it's the street.
Right.
And we could put a public restroom anywhere on that property that we wanted to. If we wanted to just put it somewhere on property, we could. Just given the fact that we just did it, though, we just redid this. I was trying to find another option besides putting it directly there on the property. But if we can't do 104 Burleson for whatever reason, then that actually might be the only real solution, is to put it, if we can't use the parking lot, then use part of the property in some way. But I would try to avoid that if we could, given where we are now.
Yeah, temporary uses, like if we have a festival and you have to go rent some porta potties, that's one thing, stacking, a few spaces in the right of way. But when you start making permanent improvements to the right of way, you have to be really careful about that.
Yeah.
Generally accepted practices and what have you. I have it as a note, though.
And I would want to be cautious about how many parking spots we lose.
Yeah, that's correct. There is a perception that there's not enough parking downtown. In most cases, that is actually not the case. We generally have way more than enough, except for Santa on the Square or events like that, where it fills up pretty quickly. But as part of the BGK downtown master plan process, one of the components of that is putting together a 12-block parking plan as well. So that way we'll have a unified, I'm not going to say it may be a parking district by default, but that way we can have a plan that we can adhere to and all that. So if we do need to remove parking at some place or add it somewhere else, we know where it needs to go specifically.
And that's those events, the Santa and such, are one reason why I'd want to leave those kind of spaces open. Well, one, because we need the parking, but two, because we probably will need to bring in extra bathrooms for specific events, and then we may need porta potties for very specific events throughout the year, because whatever we do have at South Burleson or wherever we have it, it's not going to be enough for those events where our downtown is packed. So if we leave those south side spaces open, we either have more parking or we have option to bring in extra restrooms if we need to.
Yeah, I think that's definitely appropriate. Temporary porta potty in the porta potties on the parking is probably okay. I mean, that's one thing, but okay. Any other thoughts?
I like both of them.
Okay. We'll probably also need to, if BGK, if the public restroom is a separate building from 104 South Burleson, then we need to identify funds and costs to design it. But if it's incorporated into the building, then it's already done.
Yeah.
Right. But
It's just a component of the
Yeah.
plan.
yeah.
Okay. I'll just put it down as an idea for identifying funds.
That's a great, really good idea.
Thank you. Are we all ready to move on to the next item? Okay. Item number 4D, discussion regarding code amendments to the food truck ordinance. Mr. Atkinson.
All right, this one, the item that I have in there for backup material are my proposed edits from a year plus ago. when we started looking at it. I brought it to city council. I believe I brought it to y'all to just look over. It wasn't a public hearing. We just wanted some input. But then other things have happened since then. We got sidetracked and more important things to consider. But it was an item that the city council in their visioning session that they did up in Frisco earlier this year, they wanted to bring back. So this is still in the same format. I didn't change anything related to the food truck ordinance. My intent is I do believe our current food truck ordinance is overly burdensome, without question. I think it was written to discourage food trucks. I think it's appropriate to have the option to have food trucks in Kyle. I think it's a good stepping stone, especially if you don't have a lot of capital to start a restaurant, a good stepping stone to start out at, and then eventually maybe, if it's what you desire, move into a brick and mortar district once you establish a customer base. And we've had a little bit of discussion about that with y'all on the dais. So everything that you see in these sections in red is what's existing that's marked out. Oh, well, hold on. Let me join the meeting virtually. Yeah. Bear with me just a moment. I guess it would help if you could see it too. Pull this up real quick. Bear with me just a moment. Where did it go? Okay. Here we go. I got so many tabs open on my computer. All right, there we go. All right, so everything in red that has a strike through on the is it not pulling up on your screens? Cool. Yeah, you're more than welcome to jump down there if you want. We know you're not Commissioner James or Chase. So. So everything you see that has a strike through in red is the existing that I want to remove or change, and then everything in blue I've added to the code, and everything in black is just no change. So all this is with the intent to make it easier to have a food truck in Kyle. So essentially it's split into two categories. So you have temporary food vendors and you have mobile food vendors. Mobile food vendors, and both require permits, by the way, from the building department. But a mobile food vendor is a vendor that's in place less than 4 hours, and then they pack up and they leave. A temporary food vendor can be in one place for up to 12 months. And they require a site development permit through the building department. Nothing crazy, just we need to have a 2-scale drawing showing where they're going to be, and then we just need to do a quick once-over of and make sure it's compliant. And they also have to have publicly accessible restrooms associated with that temporary food vendor for the one that's up to 12 months on site for the business that's already there. So there's already a little bit onerous requirement relating to restrooms requirements that they have to build if they don't already have them. So, which then ties into public restrooms as a question as well. But let's just go down the list, what I've shown on here. Right now, the code says a temporary food vendor is located you can be in either the retail services CBD1 or CBD2 or E entertainment zoning district if the following conditions are met. The temporary food vendor is located no closer than 50 feet from thoroughfares. That's kind of vague. The intention is they don't want the food truck acting as a temporary drive-through adjacent to streets with a window hanging out next to through the drive lane, right, for the public right-of-way. I want to change that. I think it needs to be a little bit more flexible. I think 50 feet's a little bit, especially in like the downtown area, is a little bit too burdensome. They can have it up against the property line if they want, but it needs to face into the property. They can face the public sidewalk if it's an ADA compliant sidewalk that's available. They have to have sufficient room for accessibility, and the sidewalk must be at least 6 feet wide. That way you can have a line form on half of that and still have a 3 foot wide space for ADA, for a wheelchair to get through. They can use public parking with city permission, but they can't use it as a drive-through. So, for example, what I was thinking with that is, maybe they set up shop in one of the they take up like 4 parking spaces over right by the square, on the east, south, or west side of it, but they cannot have it face into the drive lane of the street. So they can set up temporarily and then face into the property. They still need temporary barriers to delineate the space between the vendor and the street as well, just from a safety perspective. If adjacent to single-family, two-family residential, the location of the temporary food vendor may not be closer than 4 feet of such property line. The way it currently reads right now, and it's not really referenced in there in this section, they can't be closer than 25 feet to the property line, except for in the CBD2 zoning district. The 4 foot, the reason I said 4 foot is because elsewhere in our commercial code, if you're adjacent to single family or two-family residential and you're a commercial entity wanting to develop, we require a 4 foot wide landscape buffer. So it's just to match that. It's a reference to that point. So you can get as close to from that perspective to 4 feet, but you still have to have landscaping there. You can have them potted plants or whatever. Temporary food vendor may not be located in an area also not allowed in section 11-177 and 177. That's relating to food courts, and that's just generally retail services, CBD1 and CBD2. It's just a reference back to that. And I wanted to make sure that it was very clear that we do not require them to construct or provide a publicly accessible restroom associated with the permit. Requiring permanent improvements to a site when you're a temporary food vendor, in my view, is a bit ridiculous, especially because you have limited capital. You want to set up a project or a business that you can establish that customer base and just get it going and what have you. And maybe later on when you decide to actually build a restaurant, if you want to do that, then you go from that point. Now, tangentially, I'm wondering if it's a good idea to say have an exclusion there as well that says if you're within so many feet of a public restroom, like 104 South Burleson or the public park, if you don't like this idea and council doesn't go for this idea, maybe that's an exception. If there's something that's somewhere in the area within so many linear feet or what have you. We have a section in here where it talks about we won't allow another temporary food vendor within 150 feet of another temporary food vendor on the same lot. To me, that seems really restrictive. That's a big space between two food trucks. They should be able to get a little bit closer, especially if it's we don't need 150 feet between them. Now they will need to meet building code from a safety and fire, cooking, and all that kind of stuff. So if it's meeting building code, to me that's sufficient enough. I struck number 5 out because, you know, the 4-foot landscape buffer and what have you. Any questions on that section? And this is me going overboard, mind you. I didn't really have any direction. They just said, start adjusting it to make it easier. So if there's stuff that you don't feel comfortable with, that you would say, hey, let's keep this section in there, or maybe tweak this, I want to hear it.
Yeah. I've got to tell you that the 4-foot near residential gives me quite a bit of heartburn.
Okay?
I did some looking at what's being done in other areas in San Marcos and in Austin, and I think it's more, the minimum is 20 feet.
Okay.
So it just, particularly if you're talking about somebody that's going to have that for up to 12 months, I would like to see some separation between that temporary vendor and a residential area. Now, I understand you've got it in limited spaces, and it has to be within controlled districts and whatnot, but you do have some residential areas that would, abut to that, and I would like to protect those, see that there's some safety and health and safety issues, because, I think back to, there was an incident in Austin with the temporary food truck that was parked, fortunately it was downtown, but something went wrong with their propane tank and the whole thing blew up. And if you have other ones that are fairly close to either residential areas or other food trucks, you can have a chain reaction. I used to live in Bee Cave, and when the Steiner Ranch fire hit, one of the things that kept that thing going was propane tanks. You could see where the fire started to go down, and then you'd see an explosion, and the fire had spread to another propane tank, which fed it to the next one, and there was a chain reaction that happened with that. I'd hate to see something like that happen, particularly if you've got them packed into a fairly small area. So I guess from a health and safety perspective, I would like to see some separation larger than 4 feet.
Building code, or if there's something in there, perhaps at least that. I wonder if it's maybe fire code or.
Right, and that's my other question with this is, at what point does either the fire department or health representatives get to look at, potential issues for fire safety, but also if you are cooking, you've got grease that's associated with that, which has a tendency to attract vermin or various other things, and you don't want to put that into or bring that an increase into a residential area, or even have the possibility of it spreading within a confined area.
Okay. Making a note to ask the building official.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, these are just ideas that I've added to make it a little bit more flexible. And without question, there's probably stuff in there that.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I think the idea of a food truck is great. They've been very successful in a lot of areas. And it is a good way for a business to build their client base, in the event that they want to go to a brick and mortar. But I just would like to see some provisions or protections for folks that are adjacent to that.
Okay.
And so food trucks, they do get inspections just like a restaurant, right? And they have to have like the hand washing sink and the dish, all the separate compartments that a normal commercial kitchen would have.
I believe our code says that in there, 'cause they have to be inspected by the health department from the county. They have to operate out of a commissary. They have to occasionally go back and have their food truck deep cleaned and everything. And they can't have reusable dishes. They have to have disposable ones and what have you. So.
Well, speaking of that, one of the other things we came across with other areas is that the requirement was that the food be dispensed in compostable containers as opposed to styrofoam. I don't know whether there's a provision in that.
There's not. It's not reusable. Like you can't wash the dishes.
Right.
So it has to be disposable. Is that something I want to consider as I can't talk.
Compostable.
Compostable. Thank you.
Yes, I think that would be something good to look into.
I wouldn't be in favor of making that requirement, but that's just me personally.
Okay.
I do have a couple questions about what you've proposed. First, A and B. I'm not sure I understand the wording of A. The serving window may face into the property. Shouldn't A and B be combined? In the serving window shall face in the property unless, and then B, unless it's, may face a right of way into an ADA compliant sidewalk. So I think those two should be combined, and the expectation is it does face into the property unless they meet the requirement of B.
Combine 3A and B.
Because I don't understand the point of A otherwise. It may face in the property, okay, but I think we should tell them when it should or shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes it sound like it doesn't have to.
Right.
Okay.
The other concern I had, and this is more just discussion between us, for the restrooms. Now, I understand the idea. It is very restrictive to say that, a food truck pops up, has to have a restroom either with it or they're renting space from a place that lets them use the restroom. And I get it. It's much harder for food trucks if that's a requirement. If that's not a requirement, food trucks have a much easier ability to pop up but would we not be giving them an unfair advantage over the brick and mortar type businesses? That is a requirement for a brick and mortar business that you come in, you can sit down at the table, you can use the restroom. Not requiring that then of food trucks seems to incentivize doing a food truck instead of a brick and mortar business. And I don't really have an answer on this one yet. I'm just a bit concerned as to what my thought would be, what my view of that would be, had I been a person who opened a restaurant in a brick and mortar type building, and then I see this is now the food truck new ordinance. So it's more just, I don't really know, have a thought on that. I don't know one way or the other. I just kind of wanted to get your guys' thoughts on it.
Does this apply to both pop-up food trucks? Like, I remember when Torchy's was testing the market, and you'd hear, hey, Torchy's is going to be over there. They weren't providing a restroom. They were, their truck just came into town and parked, and people went and
Here?
bought stuff.
Oh, I presume I'm assuming they got a mobile food permit for 4 hours or less. So
Yeah.
mobile food vendors, they don't have to do it because they're more,
Okay,
they're just kind of
so this does not apply to them.
traveling around, or maybe they'll pop up in a HOA amenity center or something like that.
Yeah,
Or-
we'll
yeah.
hear them. Yeah, we'll hear about them in a neighborhood or something like that.
Yeah.
They're going to be over here, over there. So this does not apply to mobile.
Correct.
Okay,
It
that's-
applies to temporary, which is up to 12 months. Essentially, more than 4 hours and up to 12
Okay,
months.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
By default, yep.
I have a question about your question. So they will have to have restrooms in the vicinity, correct?
No.
Right now, they have to.
Right.
The question is, do we want to strike that requirement? And if that
Okay.
is not
Right.
something I want to do, is somewhere in between to say, hey, if there's a public restroom that the city has, that's fine.
Because
something
3F
like that.
right now, the change is saying you do not have to have a restroom any longer.
It says it's not required to construct or provide a publicly accessible restroom associated with its permit. So, yeah, I think there should be restrooms.
Okay.
At least in the at least if you, I'm just thinking of like in retail, like if you can prove like there's a restroom within, however many feet, you don't have to provide one in your retail space. So if there's like a public restroom within whatever vicinity that people can access.
But how many public restrooms do we have in the
Well,
city?
yeah, that's why we need public
That's-
restrooms.
That's the question.
I guess it would
That are
depend,
nicely
so
designed.
if they're not mobile, if they're temporary,
I think.
and I guess in the application, you're gonna be here for, well, we're just gonna give it a try for 2 weeks. All right, there's really no need for a restroom. And I guess the other thing is, are they gonna have, so it's I guess wherever they're located, it's at the park, or they're gonna show up, Friday and Saturday, whatever. Are they gonna provide sort of, well, I guess there's already seating, but if they're at a park and there's no, I guess, is the food vendor gonna provide tables and chairs to have people sit, so when they order, it's like, hey, you don't have to take it home, you can just eat here. Then in that case, if they're gonna be there on a regular basis every Friday and Saturday for, 3 months, 6 months or whatever, then yes, then they should have, it should be a requirement that they do have. But if it's just I'm only gonna, have my food truck here, and people just pick it up, and there's nowhere for them to sit, I don't think they should have to have a.
And then what about when they're cooking in the food truck? There's no restrooms in the food truck, right, for those
No.
providers? So they would, where are they
Or
gonna?
generally, there's not.
What?
Generally, there's not. I don't.
Yeah,
think
so provide a publicly accessible restroom could, in theory, be a porta potty, right, that they've rented?
It could. Does the definition of publicly accessible restroom mean ADA compliant?
Yes.
Are
I mean,
porta potties-
it
Well, I would think
should.
so.
I'm
right.
assuming it does,
Right. Are
but
porta potties ADA compliant?
I'm sure that they have
Yeah, there are some,
right?
yeah.
They have, yeah.
Okay.
So if you would have to provide, like, how many accessible?
I guess just one of each.
So the
But that
code-
depends on the code, right? Because if you
Right.
have a huge festival where you have all these food trucks, you can't just have like one restroom.
No,
It'd have
because
to be-
it's based on mass gathering. There's a certain metric for
Right.
the building code, and so the reason why we're talking about this specific question is because the food truck that's down there at the hard corner at Burleson, they're lucky that it's already there. The previous food truck was required to build a men and a woman's restroom on site because the pawn shop which owns that lot didn't have an ADA compliant restroom. So they converted the old office for the car dealership there into that.
Right.
And they were not happy that they had to do that for the extra expense, but it is what it is. The code is what the code says. And which there was a lot of going back and forth at the administration level. There was discussion like, okay, well, if it's truly temporary in nature, why would they need to provide a publicly accessible restroom? Is that going overboard on requirements or not? So that's to bring it back. That's one of the amendments to consider is, do we want to keep that requirement in there? If we don't, let's strike it. If we want to tweak it, if we want to keep it in there, is there some way to make it more equitable, if you will, from a cost perspective? And I don't know the answer. Obviously, it's great for that one down there because that makes it a good spot to have it until they're ready to actually redevelop the site. Right? I can see it both ways. But I'll say this: if I'm going to go to a food truck and it's just a one-off one, I don't actually care if there's a restroom there or not. I go and get my food and I go and leave. Maybe I'll sit at a little picnic table if they provided one, but in my mind, food trucks are temporary in nature, so I don't really.
Right.
I don't consider it usually.
This is why I was torn on it,
Yeah.
because I don't want to do things that make having food trucks more restrictive. I want them to have the ability to reasonably be in our city, but I also don't want to be the reason that there's no bathroom for both the employees and anyone in the vicinity either.
Yeah.
And so I mean I am amenable to the idea of there needs to be a bathroom within so far distance. The problem is, other than this possible one we're talking about in South Burleson,
Yeah.
there are no public restrooms. Like
Greg Clark
so,
Park.
right?
There's a couple there, but yeah.
That's fine, but to actually have you can have a mobile food truck go to Greg Clark Park. You're not gonna have a temporary one at Greg Clark Park, as far as I can tell.
You could.
Oh, okay.
You could if the city. I mean, it's on city property, so you'd have to get permission from the city to do it and set up shop there.
Okay.
I think the Parks Department is trying to encourage them more generally.
Okay.
So they're coordinating with them to set up at least mobile ones where there's no public restrooms.
So could this become part of like the comp plan or the looking at the CBD, 1 or 2 or wherever they want to have them, and then like how to incorporate public restrooms and connectivity with the rest of the, city.
It could be. And then, and that's
So it's
another
like actually
question.
planned out and like thought out rather than just like random.
Yeah, I mean, if it's more
Pop up and
appropriate to include it as a
Like a
as
little
a code
zone.
rewrite after the comp plan, or is it?
Because where are they wanting them to pop up? It's not just in like random
No, and we don't have.
spots.
I'm sure there's an idea of where we would like them, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that answer either. So that, and again, another question. Do we want to see more of them downtown, more of that pop-up kind of impromptu kind of feel? Do we want them in specific locations like public parks? Or, and also with the way the current code is written, you can even, in those specific zoning districts, establish and build a food truck court where you have permit, I like to refer to it as an RV park for food trucks, because that's what makes sense for when you
Yeah.
tell somebody that. But you have to have so many parking spaces per food truck. You got to have a dedicated bathroom in that instance, and they're tying into wet utilities as well to some extent. So there's the infrastructure in place to account for that from a grease trap perspective and all this kind of stuff. But but that's not temporary either. So that's more of a quasi-permanent
Right.
one step further.
Well,
So
as
the-
I remember, downtown Austin
Mm-hmm.
has a food court and a food, and those vendors have been there for a long, long time. And it kind of what creates the vibe for that,
Yeah.
for that area. I'm also wondering, I mean, this is just throwing this out there just for a thought too. The nodes, if they're going to have restrooms, we might want to think about incorporating space for food trucks to pop up there too, at the nodes on the Vibe Trail.
Yeah, and maybe one of the code amendments to the Vibe is
Right.
wherever there's a Vibe node, or where staff finds it appropriate to require a
Right.
restroom, it's required or something to that effect.
Yeah.
There has to be a metric though.
And make
we can't
space
just
so
we got to
that
be
they
careful
can be
about
there.
how
Yeah.
often we require it. There has to be a rational nexus to it. But yeah.
Okay. For me personally, I support these changes, except I would like to see that A and B combined, and that it would face inside unless B. And then for at least for the time frame, would strike F, and just I don't have a good answer, but the other ones, C, D, and E, I'm okay with. As for the 4 feet, I mean, I'm fine extending that further or leaving it as 4 feet. I actually can do either one on that one, whatever the group as a whole wants to see.
I have a question with the A and B. The serving window may face into the property. The serving window may face onto public right away. So you're just saying they could face either way.
But there's metrics associated. So A is like, so we're right now. I think of it like in downtown. So right now you can't be anywhere closer to 50 feet to the property line, essentially. And so that really limits where you can put it on site, even if you're facing into the site. So if we strike the 50-foot rule, it can go up to the property edge, like on a hard corner, and so it can still face into the property. It gives them more flexibility where they can put it on site, on the property, not in the public right-of-way or anything like that. But then you can also turn it if you have a sufficiently wide sidewalk where you're still sitting inside the property line, but you're facing the serving window out onto the public right-of-way. And maybe that's just not a good idea, but I don't know.
But
I wanted
on
to-
A, they should, so I just want to make sure I understand. Like unless B is true, that there is an ADA compliant sidewalk, unless that's true, the expectation is that they face in.
Yes.
Right, okay,
Correct.
so they shall face in unless,
Fair.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we all agree with that, or do we want to change that?
But when they face in, there still has to be accessible.
Yeah.
That's just
absolutely.
part of the
Right.
Yeah.
But they
Yeah.
can't face out unless there is a sidewalk on the outside.
An
That's 6 feet
accessible
wide.
sidewalk.
Right.
Right. An
Yeah.
ADA 6 feet wide. I'm
Right.
assuming a line of people are going to take up a space of 3 feet in linear fashion, just like side to side. And then, so you still have 3 feet for enough room for a wheelchair to go around them.
Okay, absolutely.
Okay, so I have that as notes. Moving on to section 11-177 for food courts. Now, this is where you put actually your permanent improvements on site. Food courts are allowed in CBD1, CBD2, retail services, and the E zoning district as well. I don't like that we have a requirement for a minimum of almost half an acre for a food court. I'm not a fan of what I feel are arbitrary minimums. I don't like that. I like it to be flexible to, each site's unique. And if you're able to practically fit those improvements on site, you should be able to. So that's why, I wanted to, and it's easier to do it from a meeting the minimum zoning district requirements. So scratching the 20,000 square foot so like for example, the retail services zoning district minimum is 50 feet wide and 6,000 square feet for a lot in retail services. So there's a chance that you can fit 1 or 2 food trucks on a 6,000 square foot lot associated with the associated parking, a permanent restroom, some tables and what have you. So that's why I did that.
Now, the food court does have a restroom?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
In B5, it says permanent lavatory and hand washing facilities of sufficient number as determined by the building official using the ICC. So, and that's why we keep referencing the building code, because the zoning's not going to dictate how many toilets you have and what have you. So, in section C, this is going back to that 4-foot rule, which we can account for, and better to do that. Signage will be displayed in accordance with 11-176-1. Oh, you need to get a permit for your sign. That's what that means. I don't like that it won't exceed the 12 units per acre. I'd rather see it just from a practical limitation of site layout. That's fire code compliant drive aisles, parking, landscaping intention, which will dictate the design in itself. They're food trucks. If they have proper fire code safety and they're scattered throughout the site in an appropriate and organized manner, that's what's important, in my opinion. And that's it. That's the only updates I have, actually. So, any questions on 11-177?
I'm good with all those.
Okay. Cool. Well, I will make, let's see, the code edits. Actually, what I'm going to be doing, at least on the food truck side, I'm going to be making, I'll have some discussion with the building official related to the 4-foot setback and fire code requirements, and what have you. So, and then I'll make the edits, or what I'm going to do in the end, I'm going to put a staff report together, and I'm going to take this to city council and let them know we've had this discussion at a workshop and get their input and go from there. And then if they're agreeable with those amendments, then we'll go from there, and we'll advertise it and in the newspaper, public hearing, all that kind of fun stuff. So I will. You can't really vote on it, but they'll know that there's the idea of the compostable stuff as well. So can't vote on it tonight, but those are the 3 items I have.
Anything else before we move on? All right, item number 5, adjournment. I move that we adjourn. It's been moved by myself, seconded by Commissioner Timmons. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed. We are adjourned.
Cool.